The last guest never entered the mansion. A Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Thornfield Hollow. The moor had already surrendered to autumn by the time Charles Lambert's motorcar rattled up the long gravel drive of Thornfield Hollow, and the house itself seemed to have surrendered with it. Grey stone walls rose against a greyer sky, and the ornamental yews that lined the approach had grown shaggy and unkempt, as though grief had crept even into the gardening. Charles had known the house since boyhood, when Lord Reginald Ashby had been a robust, red-faced man who bellowed at hounds and doted, in his gruff way, upon his children. It was strange now to think of that same man lying in the Ashby vault, dead a month, and stranger still to be summoned back to Thornfield for what Cordelia's letter had called, with careful vagueness, a small gathering before the lawyers descend upon us properly. Cordelia Ashby met him in the hall herself, which told Charles a good deal. In the old days a housemaid would have done it, and Reginald would have thundered a welcome from the library. Now the hall was dim, one lamp lit against the coming dusk, and Cordelia's face, though composed, had the fine-drawn look of a woman who had not slept easily in some weeks. "Charles, how good of you to come." She pressed his hand rather than embraced him, which was not like her. "You wrote as though something troubled you," he said, "beyond the obvious." "Everything troubles me beyond the obvious, these days." She attempted a smile. "Come in out of the damp. The others are gathering in the drawing-room, and Whitlock arrives tomorrow with the papers. After that, I dare say, we may all know where we stand." The drawing-room, when Charles entered it, held a tableau he was to remember for a long time afterward, though he did not know it yet. 5 people arranged about a fire that could not quite warm the room, each one performing an ease that none of them felt. Julian Ashby lounged nearest the flames, a glass of whisky already at hand, though it was scarcely 6 o'clock. He had his father's high colour, but none of his father's weight of purpose. 3 years younger than Charles, he had already run through 2 allowances, and by report, a good portion of a third. He looked up and gave Charles a grin too bright for the room's temper. "Lambert, come to see the vultures circle, have you?" "Julian," said a voice from the window seat, cool and quiet. "Must you?" This was Miriam, though Charles, seeing her for the first time in nearly 6 years, hesitated before the name. Miriam Ashby had left Thornfield at 22 over her father's furious objections, to marry a schoolmaster of no fortune and less family, and had not, so far as Charles knew, set foot in the house since. Widowed now, dressed in unrelieved black that was not merely for her father, she had a stillness about her that unsettled him more than Julian's noise. By the fire, in an armchair too large for her, sat a young woman Charles did not know, fair, pretty, in an anxious sort of way, dressed with more care than her evident means could easily support. Cordelia performed the introduction. Miss Louisa Fenwick, Mr. Charles Lambert, an old friend of the family. Louisa was my father's companion these last 2 years of his illness. "His nurse, really," Louisa said, with a quick, nervous laugh. "Though he preferred to call me his companion, he was very good to me." Her eyes went, for the briefest instant, to Julian, and away again. Near the door, examining a decanter with the proprietary air of a man in his own house, stood Dr. Aloysius Grant, greying at the temples, precise in his movements, the family's physician for over 20 years, and, Charles gathered, now trustee of the estate, pending the will's execution. He greeted Charles with a firm handshake and the sort of professional warmth that gave away nothing. "A sad homecoming, Lambert, though I'm glad Cordelia thought to gather a few friendly faces. These affairs go easier with company." "You mean the will?" Charles said. "I mean the will," Grant agreed. "Reginald left matters, complicated, in his last months. It will be a relief to everyone, I think, when Whitlock arrives tomorrow and reads the thing properly, and we may all stop guessing." Charles noted the word guessing, and wondered how many of them, in this room, were doing exactly that, and how many already knew, or believed they knew, precisely what the will contained. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, came in just then to announce that dinner would be at 7:30, and Charles watched her eyes move once, swiftly, over the assembled company. Julian's glass, Louisa's borrowed pearls, Miriam's black dress, Grant's decanter, with an expression he could not quite name. She had been at Thornfield since before any of them were born, had nursed Reginald through his boyhood fevers, by family legend, and now stood in the doorway of his house, like something carved from its stone, watching his children circle what remained. "Thank you, Pruitt," said Cordelia. "And Mr. Whitlock's room is made ready, my lady, though he telephoned to say he may be later than expected tomorrow. Something about calling first at his office for further papers." "Further papers," Julian repeated, and laughed without much humour. "How thrilling. I do hope they're the right ones, this time." No one asked him what he meant. Charles noticed that no one asked him, and noticed too that Cordelia's hand, resting on the back of a chair, had gone very white about the knuckles. Outside, the wind had risen, and somewhere on the moor a dog-fox was calling, thin and lonely across the darkening heath. Thornfield Hollow settled into its evening as it had settled into 10,000 evenings before, save that tomorrow a man was travelling toward it who would never cross its threshold alive. Chapter 2. A chair left empty. The next day dawned close and grey, with a mist that clung to the lower fields and did not lift even as the morning wore on. Charles came down to breakfast to find the household in a state of muted anticipation, as though the whole of Thornfield were listening for a motor car on the drive. Whitlock telephoned again at 9, Cordelia told him, buttering toast she did not eat. "He'll leave London by 10:30 and expects to reach us by 6, perhaps a little later on account of the fog forecast for the Moor Road." "And the papers?" Charles asked, keeping his voice light. "He said only that my father had lodged a further instruction with him some weeks before his death, a codicil, I collect it's called, and that it must be read alongside the will proper. He was rather mysterious about the contents. Solicitors generally are." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. Julian did not appear at breakfast at all. Miriam took her coffee alone in the morning room and answered Charles's attempt at conversation in monosyllables gentle enough not to give offence, but final enough to end the subject. Only Louisa Fenwick seemed inclined to talk, chattering with a brightness that struck Charles as effortful, about the garden, about the weather, about anything at all that was not the will. Dr. Grant spent the greater part of the day shut in the estate office with the account books, emerging once at luncheon looking, Charles thought, rather more tired than the work of a single morning ought to have made him. "Trustees' burdens," Grant said, when Charles remarked on it. "Reginald left the estate in reasonable order, but there are debts to be squared before anything can be distributed, and I confess bookkeeping was never my gift. I shall be glad when Whitlock arrives, and I may hand the whole tangle over to a professional." By 5 o'clock, the mist had thickened into something near a fog, pressing against the windows in grey coils, and the household gathered again in the drawing-room to wait. 6 o'clock came, and the tea-things were cleared, untouched by half the company. 6:30 came, and Cordelia began, almost imperceptibly, to watch the clock. "The fog will have slowed him," Grant said reasonably. "The Moor Road is treacherous enough in clear weather, and no sane man drives it fast in a fog like this." "He telephoned the lodge gate, my lady," said Mrs. Pruitt, appearing with quiet efficiency to draw the curtains against the darkening evening, just after 5, to say his motor had had some small trouble on the road, and he'd be delayed a further hour, no more. Old Sanders took the message. "Then we may expect him at 7, Cordelia said, relief plain in her voice, and gave orders that dinner be put back accordingly. 7 o'clock passed, then 1:30. Julian, who had drunk steadily and silently through the waiting hours, at last broke the strained hush of the drawing-room with a short, ugly laugh. "Perhaps he's had second thoughts. Perhaps he's decided the codicil is best left in London after all, tucked away in a very safe drawer." "Julian," said Miriam, "that is not amusing." "I wasn't attempting to be amusing, sister dear." Dinner was served, at last, at 8:30, to 6 places instead of 7, and eaten with the peculiar, hollow formality of a meal no one wishes to be at. Cordelia sent Sanders down to the lodge gate twice during the course of it, and twice he returned to report no sign of any motorcar upon the drive and no further telephone message. "He may have put up at the inn in Little Marsden," Grant suggested, over the untouched savoury. "6 miles short of us, and a good deal safer than the moor road after dark in this fog. I shouldn't wonder if that's precisely what a sensible man would do." "Edmund Whitlock," said Cordelia slowly, "has never in the 15 years I've known him done the sensible thing when the punctual thing was within his power. If he said 7, he meant 7, fog or no fog." She set down her fork. "Sanders, telephone the inn at Little Marsden, and telephone his office in London, and telephone anyone else you can think to telephone. I want to know that man is safe under some roof tonight, even if it isn't ours." The calls were made, and returned nothing. No motor car answering Whitlock's description had passed through Little Marsden. His London office, reached with some difficulty at that hour, confirmed only that he had left, as arranged, a little after 10:30 that morning, alone, with a locked dispatch case, bound for Thornfield Hollow. By 11 o'clock, the fire had burned low, and the 7 who ought to have been 8 sat in a silence no one seemed able to break. Louisa Fenwick had begun, very quietly, to cry, and no one asked her why. Charles found himself watching the empty chair that had been laid for Whitlock at dinner and never occupied, and thought, though he told himself it was only the lateness of the hour and the moaning of the wind against the old stone, that the house had never in his memory felt quite so much like a place waiting for something to happen, rather than a place where something already had. At midnight, Cordelia rose and said, in a voice stretched thin with the effort of steadiness, that there was nothing further to be done that night, and that they had all best go to their beds, and that in the morning, if there was still no word, she would send to the police. No one, going up the wide staircase in the guttering candlelight, said aloud what each of them, in some fashion, was already beginning to fear. Chapter 3. Found at the Gate. It was Thomas Reed, the gardener, who found him, a little after 7 the next morning, as the fog was only beginning to thin from the lower fields. Reed had gone down to the lodge gate to see to a broken hinge that had been troubling the estate for the better part of a week, and it was there, drawn half onto the verge some 40 yards short of the gate itself, that he came upon the motor car, a dark green saloon, its bonnet flecked with dew, its engine long since cold, and within it, slumped forward against the wheel, as though he had merely paused to rest, Edmund Whitlock. He was quite dead, and had been, Dr. Grant pronounced within the half-hour, kneeling awkwardly in the wet grass beside the open door, for a good many hours, since sometime the previous evening, he judged, though the fog and the cold made any closer estimate difficult. There was no wound upon him, no blood, no violence to the body that the eye could readily discover. His hands lay loose upon his knees, his hat had fallen to the floor of the car, and on the seat beside him, uncapped and empty, lay a small silver hip flask, engraved with his initials, that Grant lifted with careful fingers and sniffed at, and set down again without a word. "Heart," said Julian, who had come down with the others at the news, and stood now a little apart, unusually subdued. "Poor devil, the moor road at night, in that fog, enough to try any man's heart." "Perhaps," said Grant, but his voice carried a caution that made Charles look sharply at him. Cordelia, white to the lips, had turned away from the car entirely, and stood with one gloved hand pressed to the gate-post, as though the stone alone could hold her upright. "He never reached the house," she said, to no one in particular. "He was not 40 yards from our gate, and he never reached the house." It was Mrs. Pruitt, arriving belatedly, out of breath, having heard the commotion from the kitchen garden, who asked the question that none of the family, in their shock, had yet thought to ask. "His case, my lady, the dispatch case, with the papers, is it in the motor with him?" There was a brief, unpleasant silence while Grant and Charles between them searched the car, the seats, the floor, the small compartment beneath the dashboard. The dispatch case was there, on the floor behind the driver's seat, its lock forced rather than picked, the leather scarred about the hasp as though by a knife or a heavy tool. Inside it, when Grant drew it open with visibly unsteady hands, lay a sheaf of papers, legal documents, headed with the name of Whitlock's firm, bound with the usual pink tape. But Cordelia, taking them with trembling fingers and turning through them under Charles's borrowed torch, gave a small, sharp exclamation. "This is not—" She stopped and began again, more carefully. "This is my father's will, as it stood 2 years ago. I have seen this document. I witnessed a copy of it myself, when he first drew it. But he telephoned only yesterday to say he was bringing a codicil, new papers, drawn within these last weeks." "These are not those papers. These are old ones." "Are you certain?" Grant asked. "I am entirely certain, Dr. Grant. I do not forget my own father's handwriting, or the date beneath it." Cordelia looked up, and in the grey morning light, her face had lost its shock and taken on something harder, more deliberate. "Someone has taken what Edmund Whitlock was bringing to this house and left this in its place." Julian, who had gone very quiet, said at last, "You're not suggesting—" "Cordelia," the man's heart gave out. "It happens. It happened to father, didn't it? Not a month past." "I am suggesting," Cordelia said, "that a man does not force open his own dispatch case and substitute his own papers before conveniently dying of a weak heart 40 yards from a house he was never permitted to enter. Dr. Grant, what killed him?" Grant hesitated a long moment, looking down at the still figure in the car, at the small empty flask upon the seat, and when he spoke, his careful professional voice had gone unexpectedly grim. "I should not like to say, with certainty, before a proper examination. But I will tell you this much, Lady Ashby, since you press me for it. I do not think this was his heart alone. I think it very possible that something was put into that flask before ever he lifted it to his lips." He straightened, wiping his hands upon his handkerchief with a fastidiousness that seemed, in the moment, almost obscene. "I think, in short, that we had better send not merely for the police, but for someone who knows how to ask the sort of questions the police are not always trained to ask." It was Cordelia, recovering, in that instant, something of her father's old decisiveness, who answered him. "I have already written to such a man," she said quietly, "though I did not, until this morning, know quite why I felt I must. He is an old friend of my father's, and I believe, I hope, that he is even now on his way." Chapter 4. The Little Belgian Arrives. Hercule Poirot arrived at Thornfield Hollow a little after 3 that afternoon, in a hired motor car that navigated the last, rutted mile of the drive, with evident and vocal disapproval from its passenger, who emerged from it dabbing at his moustaches as though the fog itself had personally offended them. He was, Charles thought, watching from the library window, a singular figure to find upon a Yorkshire moor. A small man, egg-headed, exquisitely dressed, for a house he must have known would offer him nothing but mud and grief, and moving with the fussy, deliberate precision of a man for whom every gesture had already been considered and approved before it was made. Cordelia went out to meet him herself, and Charles, following at a little distance, heard her greeting, "Monsieur Poirot, thank God," and saw the small detective take both her hands in his own and hold them a moment, his sharp eyes assessing her face with a gentleness that surprised Charles, given all he had heard of the man's reputation for cold logic. "Madam," Poirot said, "I received your letter 3 days past, and I confess it troubled me a great deal, for your father, whom I knew a little in years gone by, was not a man who died conveniently, nor whose daughter would write to strangers without grave cause. I came as swiftly as the trains, and this deplorable road, permitted, and now I find, from the telegram that reached me at the station not 2 hours ago, that I come not merely to soothe a daughter's unquiet mind, but to a house where a man lies dead who should not be dead. Tell me everything from the beginning, and leave out nothing, however small it seems to you." They walked together toward the house, and Charles, falling in behind, thought he had rarely heard a voice so mild ask, in effect, for so much. Poirot was given the room that had been prepared for Whitlock, a detail he noted with a small, unreadable flicker of the brow, and within the hour had assembled the household in the drawing-room, where, 2 evenings before, they had waited so fruitlessly for a guest who would never arrive. "I will not pretend to you," he began, standing before the cold hearth with his hands folded neatly before him, "that I come here as a friend only, though I was your father's friend, madame, in a small way, many years ago, in Brussels, before the war, when he did me a service I have not forgotten. I come now because a man is dead under circumstances that permit no comfortable explanation, and because his death, I say this to you plainly, for I think you have already guessed it, is bound up, in some fashion not yet clear to me, with the death of your father 1 month past." The room received this with a stillness that Charles felt rather than saw, a held breath, a stiffening, passing from face to face like a current. "That's a monstrous suggestion," Grant said, after a moment, his professional composure only just holding. "Lord Ashby died of heart failure, in his own bed, with his own physician in attendance. I signed the certificate myself." "You did, Monsieur le Docteur. I have no doubt at all that you did." Poirot's small eyes, bright as a bird's, rested on Grant a moment longer than courtesy strictly required. "But a certificate is only a form of words, and words may be true, or may be, how shall I say it, incomplete. I do not accuse. I only observe that it is a very great coincidence for a man to die naturally, and for the lawyer bringing his final wishes to this house to die unnaturally 1 month later, not 40 yards from the door, with his papers stolen and false papers left in their place. I do not believe, messieurs et mesdames, in such coincidences. My little grey cells rebel against them." "Then what do you believe, monsieur?" Miriam asked. It was the first thing she had said since Poirot's arrival, and her voice was very steady. "I believe, madame, that I have a great deal of listening to do, and very little to say until I have done it. I should like, if you will permit it, to speak with each of you in turn, this evening, if it can be arranged. And I should like, also, to see the motor car in which Mr. Whitlock was found, and the room in which your father died, and the gate through which one guest never passed. I should like," he added, with a small, unexpected smile that did nothing to soften the sharpness beneath it, "to know everything that Thornfield Hollow has been keeping to itself these last weeks. Houses, like people, keep secrets, and this house, I think, has been keeping a great many." Cordelia, very pale, inclined her head. "You shall have whatever you ask for, Monsieur Poirot. I want the truth, whatever it costs any of us." "That," said Poirot softly, glancing once around the circle of watching faces, Julian's careful blankness, Louisa's damp eyes, Grant's stiff professional calm, Miriam's unreadable stillness, Mrs. Pruitt's silent presence in the doorway, "is a very brave thing to say, madame, in a room such as this one. I hope, when the truth is known, that you will still be glad you said it." Chapter 5. Questions in the Drawing Room. Poirot conducted his interviews, that evening, in the small morning room, seated behind a writing desk he had commandeered with the air of a man taking possession of territory. A single lamp, throwing warm light across papers, he had begun, already, to accumulate in small, precise stacks. He saw Dr. Grant first. "You attended Lord Ashby throughout his final illness, Monsieur le Docteur. For the better part of 2 years, he suffered from a weak heart, complicated in the last months by a wasting of the appetite that I attributed, at the time, to the general decline of a man past 70. And the symptoms of this decline. Describe them to me, if you please, in detail." Grant did so, with the fluent, practiced ease of a physician long accustomed to explaining illness to laymen: the loss of weight, the occasional confusion, the increasing weakness of the limbs, the final failure of the heart itself, in the small hours of a September morning, with Grant himself at the bedside. It is a description, Poirot observed, when he had finished, that would fit equally well a weak heart in slow decline, or a body being slowly and carefully poisoned over some months. You are aware of this, I think." Grant's face did not change, but his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, closed slightly. "I am aware that such things exist in textbooks, Monsieur Poirot. I did not consider it my duty to suspect poison in the sick room of an old friend, on no evidence beyond a general resemblance of symptoms that 100 natural illnesses might equally produce." "No," Poirot agreed mildly. "No, I do not suppose you did." He made a small note. "Tell me of the estate accounts, monsieur. I understand you act as trustee, pending the will's proper execution." "I do. Reginald trusted me with a great deal in his last years, more perhaps than my talents for figures entirely justified. I have been putting the books in order these past weeks, in expectation of Whitlock's arrival, so that the estate might pass cleanly to whoever inherits it." "And do the books balance, Monsieur le Docteur?" There was the smallest of pauses. Estates of this size rarely balance to the penny. There are always small discrepancies, old debts, forgotten expenditures. Nothing, I should say, that a competent auditor could not explain in a morning's work. "Bien," said Poirot, and made another note, and asked Grant nothing further of consequence, though Charles, permitted to sit quietly in the corner, as an old family friend whose discretion Poirot had, with surprising swiftness, come to trust, thought the little detective's pen moved rather more than the brevity of Grant's answers seemed to warrant. Julian came next, sprawling into the chair opposite Poirot, with a bravado Charles suspected covered considerable unease. "I suppose you want to know whether I killed the wretched man to keep him from reading me out of my inheritance," Julian said, before Poirot had asked a single question. "You anticipate me, monsieur. It is a bad habit, in a suspect, to answer questions I have not yet troubled to ask. It suggests he has rehearsed the answers a little too carefully." Poirot's eyes did not leave Julian's face. "But since you raise it, did your father intend to read you out of his will?" "How the devil should I know? He never told me anything, these last 2 years, except that I was a disappointment to him, which I had contrived to work out for myself without his assistance." Julian's bravado cracked, briefly, into something rawer. "We quarrelled. Badly, the last time I saw him alive. Over money, over Louisa, over everything a father and a wastrel son generally quarrel over. I dare say half this house heard it. I don't deny it, because I couldn't, even if I wished to, and I've stopped wishing to lie about the things that don't matter, if it's all the same to you. And the things that do matter, monsieur, do you lie about those?" Julian met his eyes for a long moment, and something flickered there that Charles could not read. Fear, perhaps, or grief, or both. "I was in my room, the night Whitlock died, alone. No one can swear to it, and I can't prove it, and I know precisely how that sounds. That's all I have to offer you, monsieur, and I'm aware it isn't much." Poirot regarded him a moment longer, then inclined his head and let him go, and called for Louisa Fenwick, who came in twisting her hands and would not, at first, meet his eyes at all. Chapter 6. The Solicitor's Secret. "You were Lord Ashby's companion, mademoiselle, in his final years," Poirot said gently, when Louisa had seated herself, "and I think, perhaps, a good deal more attached to him than the word companion generally suggests. Do not be alarmed. I do not judge you for it. An old man, lonely and ill, and a young woman with kindness to spare. Such attachments are natural and often innocent, whatever the household may whisper of them." Louisa's eyes filled, but she nodded. "He was kind to me, monsieur, kinder than anyone had been, in a long while. I had no family of my own worth speaking of, and no prospects, and he used to say I reminded him of Miriam, before she left. He was very unhappy, you know, about Miriam leaving. He never said so to her, but he said it to me, often, in his last year, when the pain was bad and he couldn't sleep." "And did he speak to you of his will, mademoiselle? Of what he intended, for you or for his children?" She hesitated a long moment. He told me, near the end, that he meant to see me provided for. A small sum, nothing grand, but enough that I need not go into service again, or worse. He said he had told Mr. Whitlock to add it to the will, quietly, in a codicil, because he didn't want a fuss made of it while he lived, and because he— She stopped. Because he what, mademoiselle? Because he said there were other things in the codicil that would cause fuss enough, without mine added to it. Her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. He wouldn't tell me what, but he was frightened, monsieur, in those last weeks. Not of dying, I don't think, but of something else. He kept saying he must set things right before it was too late, and that Dr. Grant mustn't know the particulars until Mr. Whitlock had it all down properly in writing, witnessed and sealed. Poirot went very still. He did not trust Dr. Grant? He never said so in words, but he stopped letting Dr. Grant see the account books alone, those last weeks. Insisted Mrs. Pruitt sit with them, or myself, whenever the doctor came to go over the estate matters. I thought it strange at the time. I think it's stranger now. She twisted her hands again. I told Dr. Grant that, monsieur, a few days after Lord Ashby's funeral. I didn't mean anything by it. It was only that Dr. Grant asked me, quite naturally, what his lordship's mood had been like at the end, and it came out along with everything else. I've thought of it every day since Mr. Whitlock died, and I can't make it stop. You told Dr. Grant, Poirot said slowly, that Lord Ashby distrusted him regarding the accounts, and had instructed a codicil be drawn, that Dr. Grant was not to see until it was witnessed. When, precisely, did you tell him this, mademoiselle? The Tuesday before Mr. Whitlock died, 3 days before. Poirot said nothing for a long moment, his small eyes fixed on some point beyond Louisa's shoulder, and Charles, watching, felt the temperature of the room seem to drop, though the fire burned on unchanged. "Thank you, mademoiselle," Poirot said at last, very gently. "You have been of great help to me, though I think you did not intend, 3 days before a man died, to hand anyone the key to a door they should never have been permitted to open. Do not blame yourself too greatly. The blame belongs elsewhere, and I begin, I think, to see where." When she had gone, weeping quietly, Poirot sat a long while in silence, turning his pen over and over between his fingers, before he spoke to Charles, still seated in his corner. "You see it too, mon ami, do you not? The shape of the thing beginning to show itself beneath the fog, like the moor beneath the mist this morning." "I see that Grant had a reason to want Whitlock silenced," Charles said slowly, "if the codicil concerned the accounts he'd been keeping. You see the beginning of it, but a beginning is not an ending, and I have learned, in a long career, that the man who looks most guilty in the first act very often turns out to be guilty of nothing worse than foolishness, or cowardice, or a broken heart he does not wish the world to see. No, mon ami, I must speak with the housekeeper and with Madame Miriam, and I must see the room where Lord Ashby died and the motor car where Monsieur Whitlock was found, before I permit myself to believe anything at all. The little grey cells, they are patient. It is only the impatient man who convicts the wrong suspect and lets the true one dine, that same evening, quite comfortably, at his own table. Chapter 7. Threads of the Moor Inspector Yardley of the County Constabulary arrived at Thornfield the following morning. A heavy, sensible man, with a heavy, sensible moustache, who regarded Poirot's presence with the wary courtesy of a professional forced to share his territory with an amateur of formidable reputation. "Straightforward enough case, to my mind, Monsieur Poirot, whatever complications you may be pleased to find in it," Yardley said, as the two of them walked down toward the gate together, Charles trailing a little behind. "Young Ashby's up to his ears in debt. Half the moneylenders in York could tell you that, and stood to lose whatever this codicil business meant to give him. Man's got no alibi worth the name, admits himself he quarrelled bitterly with his father, and a good deal of gossip in the village has it he'd been overheard threatening worse than quarrels, more than once, when his drink was up in him. You have spoken with the village, Inspector?" "I have." Landlord at the Ashby Arms says Julian Ashby came in 3 nights before old Ashby died and drank himself half insensible, shouting to anyone who'd listen that his father meant to cut him off without a farthing and leave the lot to that little jumped-up nurse. Begging your pardon for the phrase, but that's what was said, and half the taproom heard it. Yardley looked pleased with himself. Motive, means, and no alibi. I don't say I've made my mind up entirely, but I'd want a good deal of persuading to look much further. Poirot walked on a little way in silence, his stick tapping the gravel with small, precise sounds. It is, as you say, Inspector, a very convenient thread to pull. Young Ashby, angry, in debt, overheard threatening exactly the outcome that occurred. It has the shape of guilt very exactly, so exactly, in fact, that I confess it makes me uneasy, rather than satisfied. Meaning no disrespect, Monsieur Poirot, but that sounds a deal like a man determined to find complications where a plain answer will do. Perhaps, Poirot agreed pleasantly. Or perhaps it is the answer that has been arranged to look plain, for the benefit of exactly the sort of sensible man who prefers not to look twice at a threat, overheard in a public taproom, 3 nights before a convenient death, and repeated with such thoroughness to the local constabulary. Tell me, Inspector, who first directed your attention to the Ashby Arms, and to that particular piece of gossip? Yardley considered. Dr. Grant, as it happens, came to see me himself, the morning the body was found, most concerned to see justice done swiftly, for the sake of the family's peace of mind. Gave me the name of the inn, and suggested I make inquiries there. Did he? Said Poirot softly. Indeed. He stopped walking, and turned to look back at the grey bulk of Thornfield Hollow, rising out of the thinning mist. Inspector, I do not ask you to abandon young Ashby as a suspect. A man may be guilty of exactly the crime his enemies would wish him accused of, and it would be an error of logic to assume the opposite merely because the accusation is convenient. But I ask you to hold your conclusion a little longer, and to permit me to examine 1 or 2 matters that interest me a great deal more than the gossip of a taproom, namely, the exact condition of Mr. Whitlock's motor car when it was found, and the precise wording of the message received at the lodge gate the evening before. They reached the gate as he spoke, where the dark green saloon still stood, guarded now by a young constable stamping his feet against the cold. Poirot circled it slowly, twice, his eyes moving over the tyres, the doors, the churned mud of the verge, with the meticulous, unhurried attention of a man for whom no detail was beneath notice. The car was found here, 40 yards short of the gate, drawn onto the verge as though parked deliberately, not skidded or crashed. And yet, Inspector, observe, the tyre tracks in this mud are not 1 set, but 2, overlaying one another, as though the car came to rest first in one position, and was later moved a little distance, and set down again in almost, but not quite, the same place. He crouched, with some difficulty, beside the nearer front wheel, and traced a line in the mud with his stick. Here, and here, you see it. Yardley crouched beside him, frowning, and after a long moment grunted. By God, there is a second track. Might be nothing. Might be the fellow pulled forward and reversed again, looking for a place to stop. It might, Poirot agreed. Or it might mean that Mr. Whitlock's motor car did not come to its final rest until some hours after Mr. Whitlock himself had ceased to be capable of driving it. And that, Inspector, is a very different account of the evening from the one your taproom gossip would have us believe. For a man raging drunk in his father's hall, or brooding alone and unwatched in his bedroom, cannot very easily also be down here at the gate, some hours later, quietly moving a dead man's motor car a few careful yards along a foggy verge. Yardley straightened slowly, his sensible confidence, for the first time, visibly shaken. You're saying someone came back to the scene? I am saying, Inspector, that someone was very careful indeed, careful enough to steal a set of papers and leave false ones in their place, careful enough to choose a poison, if poison it proves to be, that mimics the failure of a weak heart, careful enough even to consider the exact position in which a motor car ought to be found. That is not the carelessness of a young man half mad with debt and drink, raging in a public house 3 nights before. That, mon ami, is the coldness of a mind that has been planning, quietly, for a very much longer time than 3 days. Chapter 8. More Lies. Surface Mrs. Pruitt received Poirot in her own small sitting room off the kitchen passage, a room of scrubbed cleanliness and framed photographs. Reginald Ashby, as a boy in a sailor suit. Reginald Ashby, as a young man on his wedding day. Reginald Ashby, grey and stooped in his last summer, seated in the rose garden with a rug over his knees. She sat very upright in her chair, hands folded, and answered Poirot's questions with the guarded precision of a woman who had spent 50 years learning what a servant might say and what she must not. "You have been at Thornfield since before Lord Ashby's own birth, I understand, madame," Poirot began. "Since before his father's time, monsieur. My own mother was housekeeper here before me. I have known Master Reginald, Lord Ashby, I should say, since he was in his cradle." "Then you loved him?" Something moved behind her composed face, quickly suppressed. "I served him faithfully, monsieur, for 60 years. I don't know that a woman in my position is much entitled to speak of love in respect of the family she serves. But I will say I never served a family I was gladder to serve until these last years, when things began to go wrong." "Go wrong? How, madame?" "Money going where it oughtn't. Bills that didn't tally with what I knew the house had spent. Dr. Grant coming and going with the account books more often than his lordship's health could rightly explain, and his lordship growing quieter and greyer and more frightened seeming, month on month, until near the end he wouldn't so much as sign a cheque without I or Miss Fenwick stood by to witness it." She met Poirot's eyes directly for the first time. "I don't say I know what killed him, monsieur. I'm not a doctor, and I won't pretend to knowledge I don't have. But I'll say this. I never believed it was only his heart, and I said so, to Dr. Grant himself, not 3 weeks before he died." Poirot went very still. "You said this to Dr. Grant. What precisely did you say, madame, and what did he answer?" "I said I thought his lordship was failing faster than any weak heart alone would account for, and that I hoped the doctor was quite satisfied there was nothing else amiss. He told me I had no business speaking of matters outside my province, and that I would do well to keep such thoughts to myself, for the sake of the household's peace." Her mouth tightened. "I kept them to myself, monsieur, as I was told. I have wondered, every day since Mr. Whitlock died at our gate, whether I ought to have kept them a good deal less quietly." "You did what any loyal servant would do, madame, and you are not to blame for a silence that was, in truth, requested of you by someone with a great deal more to hide than you." Poirot's voice was gentle, but Charles, watching, saw the sharpness beneath it, like a blade, wrapped carefully in velvet. "Tell me one thing further, madame, and I ask it with great particularity. On the night Mr. Whitlock was expected, and did not arrive, where was each member of this household, so far as you observed it, between the hours of 6 and 11? Mrs. Pruitt considered this with the same careful precision she brought to everything. "Mr. Julian was in the drawing-room until near 8, drinking heavily, and then went up to his room, and I believe stayed there, though I can't swear to it past 9, when I went up myself to see the fires banked. Mrs. Vane, Miriam that is, sat in the window seat a long while, and then walked out into the garden, a little after 7, saying she couldn't bear the waiting indoors, and didn't return until near 8, wet through with the fog. Miss Fenwick stayed in the drawing-room the whole evening, weeping on and off, poor lamb. And Dr. Grant," she paused, "and Dr. Grant, madame." Dr. Grant excused himself a little after 6:30, saying he had a call to make on old Mrs. Harker in the village, who'd been poorly. He didn't return until close on 10, and when he did, monsieur, his boots were wet through with mud to the ankle, and I remember thinking at the time it was a great deal of mud for a man who'd only driven to the village and back in his motor car. I thought no more of it then. I have thought of very little else since." Poirot sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him, and when he spoke again, His voice had dropped almost to a murmur, as though he addressed himself rather than the room. A call upon a sick woman in the village, made on foot, it would seem, through the mud of the moor. On the very evening, a man died at this house's gate, not 40 yards from where his motor car was later found, moved a careful distance in the fog. He looked up. "Madame, does Mrs. Harker's cottage lie along the road that passes this gate?" "It does, monsieur. There's no other way to reach the village from the house, save that road." "Then Dr. Grant," said Poirot softly, "passed this gate, on foot, in the fog. At very nearly the hour, Mr. Whitlock's motor car came to a stop beside it, and returned home with mud to his ankles, and told no one, so far as I have yet learned, that he had done so. I think, madame, that I must ask Inspector Yardley to verify, with some care, whether Mrs. Harker received any visit at all that evening, from her physician or anyone else." Chapter 9. A Discrepancy in the Mud. Inspector Yardley returned from the village late that afternoon, with his sensible confidence a good deal further shaken than it had been that morning. "Mrs. Harker swears blind she's had no visit from Dr. Grant in above a fortnight," he reported, standing dripping in the hall, having ridden the moor road at speed through a fresh spatter of rain. "Says her chest's been troubling her, right enough, but she's been dosing herself with her own remedies, same as always, and hasn't laid eyes on the doctor since he called to see to her knee, back before Lord Ashby's funeral." "And yet Dr. Grant told this household he had gone to attend her," Poirot said. "On the very evening, Mr. Whitlock's motor car was moved upon the verge outside this gate. I put it to him myself, direct, not 20 minutes past," Yardley said, mopping his moustache. "He went white as the tablecloth, Monsieur Poirot, and then he claimed he'd misremembered, said he'd meant to call on her, changed his mind part way, and walked a distance on the moor instead, to clear his head, being troubled, as any man might be, by the general upset of the household. Wouldn't account for the mud beyond that, nor for the hour he came in, nor for anything much at all, if I'm honest, save to grow more evasive with every question I put to him. A man troubled by the general upset of the household," Poirot repeated thoughtfully, "chooses, on the one evening a guest is overdue, and the whole family waits anxiously for news, to absent himself for upward of 3 hours, walking alone upon a foggy moor, past the very gate where that guest will shortly be found dead, and returns telling a story of a sick visit that never took place. It is not, Inspector, an account that satisfies the little grey cells." They stood a moment in silence, and then Poirot beckoned Charles and the inspector to follow him out once more into the thinning afternoon light, down toward the gate, where the constable still stood his patient vigil beside the green saloon. "I wish," Poirot said, "to examine again the ground here, now that the mud has dried a little, and shows its marks more plainly than it did in the wet confusion of that first morning." He walked slowly along the verge, his eyes on the ground, and stopped at last some yards short of the car itself, beside a stretch of turf still soft from the days of fog and drizzle. "Here," he said. "Look, Inspector, footprints, a man's, coming from the direction of the house, along this same track that Dr. Grant would have taken toward the village. And here, see how the prints pause, and turn, and approach the motor car itself, and then return again the way they came, some little time later, if the depth and the freshness of the mud are any guide." He crouched, tracing the pattern with his stick, as he had traced the tire marks 2 days before. "A man came from the house, on foot, to this gate, on the evening in question. He paused here, beside where the car would come to rest, and he returned to the house. That fits Grant's own account, near enough," Yardley said slowly, "save that he claims he only walked, and never came near the car nor the gate itself." "Precisely, Inspector. He has told you a story constructed to be very nearly true. A walk upon the moor, in the general direction he did, in fact, walk, but omitting the one particular that would hang him, which is that his walk brought him directly to the place, and at very nearly the hour, that a man was dying, or already dead, in a motor car drawn onto this verge." Poirot straightened, brushing the mud from his knees with an expression of considerable distaste. "It is the oldest trick of the guilty man, mon ami, to tell the truth in every particular, save the one that matters, so that when he is caught in that single lie, he may protest, with perfect sincerity, that everything else he said was true. It very often works, on juries less patient than I am." "Are you telling me Grant's our man, then, plain and simple?" Yardley asked, not without a note of hope. A plain and simple answer would have suited him a good deal better than the tangle Poirot seemed determined to unravel thread by patient thread. "I am telling you, Inspector, that Dr. Grant has lied to you about his movements on the night of the murder, that he had every material reason to fear what a codicil concerning the estate accounts might reveal, and that his boots were muddied in a manner consistent with a walk to this very gate. It is a great deal of smoke, Inspector, and smoke of that density very often does mean fire." Poirot's eyes had grown distant, turned inward upon some calculation Charles could not follow. "But I am not yet satisfied, and I will tell you why. A man clever enough to poison a flask with a substance chosen to mimic natural heart failure, clever enough to force a dispatch case and substitute false papers with such care that the substitution was not discovered until the papers were examined by lamplight in this house, is not, I think, a man who leaves so plain and so damning a trail of footprints for the first competent observer to find. It troubles me, Inspector. It troubles me very much. I begin to wonder whether Dr. Grant is guilty of everything you suspect him of, or whether he is guilty of a great deal less than murder, and is lying to you now only to conceal that lesser guilt, out of a fear that, once discovered, will look, to any sensible jury, exactly like the greater one." Chapter 10. The doctor's ledger confronted a second time, that evening, in the small morning room, with Yardley standing grim beside the door. Dr. Grant's careful composure finally gave way. "Very well," he said, and his voice, for the first time since Charles had known him, shook. "Very well, I did go to the gate that night. I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot, I swear it before God, but I did go there, and I did see him, and I have been a coward and a liar for 3 days rather than admit it, because I knew precisely how it would look, and I was right, wasn't I? It looks exactly like a hanging." "Tell me what you saw, monsieur," Poirot said quietly, "and tell me the truth this time, in every particular, or I promise you the inspector's rope will feel very much closer by morning than it does tonight." Grant pressed his hands together and began, haltingly, as a man does who has held a confession too long and finds it, once begun, unwilling to stop. "There have been discrepancies in the estate accounts, as I told you. I did not lie about that, whatever else I have lied about. I have managed the Ashby estate for 11 years, and for the better part of the last 3, I have borrowed, is the word I use to myself, though I know now it was never anything but theft, from the estate funds, to cover debts of my own. Gambling debts, Monsieur Poirot, if you must have the shameful particular of it. My own vice, not young Ashby's, though God knows I let the family and the county believe otherwise, when it suited me, and I am ashamed of that above almost everything else I have done." "Continue," said Poirot, his voice without judgment, only patience. Reginald began to suspect, near the end. He was ill, but he was never a fool, and he found discrepancies I had thought too small and too well hidden for an old man's failing eyes to catch. He said nothing to me directly. That was his way, always, to gather his evidence quietly before he struck. But he instructed Whitlock, I learned only after his death, to draw a codicil requiring a full independent audit of the estate accounts before any distribution was made, with myself removed as sole trustee and a solicitor's clerk appointed to oversee the accounts jointly, in perpetuity. Grant's voice cracked. "It would have ended me, Monsieur Poirot, not merely my position, my liberty. Theft from an estate in my trust is a matter for the criminal courts, not merely for disgrace. And when Miss Fenwick told you, 3 days before Whitlock's death, that a codicil existed, which you were not to see until it was witnessed and sealed, you understood then precisely what it must contain. I understood it well enough to be sick with terror for 3 days and nights. Yes. Grant looked up, and his eyes were wet. I will tell you what I did, and you may believe it or not, as you choose. But it is the truth, and I have no further reason left to lie. I went to the gate that evening, on foot, meaning, I hardly know what I meant. To speak with Whitlock before he entered the house, perhaps. To beg him, God help me, to give me some warning, some chance to set matters right before the codicil was read aloud before the whole family. I am not a brave man, Monsieur Poirot, nor, I have discovered this week, a particularly honest one, but I am not, whatever you may currently believe, a murderer. What did you find when you reached the gate? I found the motor car exactly where it was later discovered, though I did not move it, whatever your footprints and tire tracks may suggest to you. I found Whitlock already dead, slumped over the wheel, quite cold, the flask already empty beside him. I did not touch the dispatch case. I swear that to you on whatever you hold sacred. I stood there in the fog and the dark, Monsieur Poirot, beside a dead man I had perhaps come too late to save, or perhaps could never have saved at all. And I understood, in that moment, that whatever the codicil contained, whatever ruin it might have brought me, it scarcely mattered now beside the far greater ruin of a murdered man at my family's gate, and I was seized, God forgive me, with nothing but terror for myself. And I turned, and I walked home through the fog, and I told no one what I had seen, and I have been telling myself ever since that my silence changed nothing, that he was dead already and past any help of mine, and that my only crime was cowardice. He put his face in his hands. I did not kill him, but I left him there, in the dark, and did not even send help for a body I already knew to be beyond it. And I do not know, gentlemen, how a man is meant to live with a silence like that, whatever the law decides to call it. Poirot regarded him for a long moment in silence, and when he spoke, his voice held something that was not quite sympathy, but was not without it either. You are guilty, monsieur, of theft and of cowardice, and of a silence that has cost this investigation 3 valuable days, and very nearly cost an innocent man his liberty in your place. These are not small sins, and I do not diminish them. But they are not, I think, and here the little grey cells, for what they are worth, incline strongly to believe you, the sin of murder. For if you had murdered Edmund Whitlock, monsieur, poisoned his flask before ever he reached this gate, forced his dispatch case and stolen the codicil that would ruin you, why then return to the scene, on foot, in the fog, hours later, and risk exactly the discovery that has now, in fact, undone you? A murderer who has already secured the papers he needed has no reason at all to go back and stand beside his victim's body a second time. Only an innocent, terrified man, uncertain what had truly happened, and desperate for some scrap of reassurance, would do a thing so purposeless and so fatally foolish. Grant looked up, hope warring with disbelief in his ravaged face. Then you believe me? I believe, said Poirot carefully, that you did not kill Edmund Whitlock. I do not yet believe you are entirely innocent of everything that has happened in this house, monsieur, for a man who steals from the dying and lies to the living so fluently is not a man whose word I take entirely on trust. But murder, no. I think, on this one point, you have told me, at the last, the truth. Which means, messieurs et mesdames, he added, rising, and looking round at Yardley with an expression that had grown suddenly, sharply alert, that the person who poisoned that flask, and forced that case, and substituted those false papers, and, I think now, with rather greater confidence than before, the person who first began, some months since, to poison an old man slowly in his own bed, is a person we have not yet properly examined at all. And I think it is time that we did. Chapter 11. Old Wounds Reopened. It was Miriam who came to Poirot, unbidden, the following morning, before he had even sent for her, found him walking alone in the rose garden, where, Charles gathered, her father had liked to sit in his last summer, and stood before him with the particular stillness Charles had noticed in her since his arrival, though now it seemed less composure than the exhaustion of a woman who has carried something heavy for a very long time and can no longer quite manage the weight of it alone. "I think, Monsieur Poirot, that you had better hear something from me directly, rather than piece it together from servants' gossip and old letters, as I gather is rather your method." "I am listening, madame, with great attention." She did not sit, though there was a stone bench nearby. She stood, very straight, looking not at Poirot, but out across the withered rose-beds toward the gardener's cottage at the far wall. "I left this house at 22, monsieur, over my father's objections, to marry a schoolmaster he considered beneath our family entirely. That much the household knows, and gossips over freely enough. What the household does not know, what only my father knew, at the end, and Mrs. Pruitt, who has known it these 26 years and kept it faithfully, is that I did not leave Thornfield for love of a schoolmaster at all, not at first. I left because I was carrying a child, monsieur, at 18, unmarried, and my father, for all his temper, and God knows it was fearsome, could not bring himself to send me away in disgrace, nor to keep me here and watch the county destroy what remained of my prospects with its whispering." Poirot said nothing, but his eyes had gone very grave, very attentive. Mrs. Pruitt had lost an infant of her own, that same winter, stillborn, and her grief is, I believe, even now, a wound that never properly closed. Between them, my father and Mrs. Pruitt arranged it so that my son was given to her to raise as her own sister's child, orphaned and sent to her from Leeds, so the story went, and I was sent myself, a little later, to relations in Scotland, until the whole matter could be decently buried, and I returned, in time, older and quieter, and eventually married my schoolmaster, who never knew, and never asked, why I wept sometimes in October, which was the month my son was born. "And the child, madame," Poirot said gently. "He grew up in this parish. He is a man now." Miriam's composure cracked, at last, just slightly. "Thomas Reed is my son, Monsieur Poirot. He has never known it. Mrs. Pruitt raised him as her nephew, and loved him, I believe, as fiercely as any mother, and I have watched him grow from a distance these 26 years, at Christmas visits and chance meetings in the village, and said nothing, because I did not know how to say it, and because I believed, always, that the silence protected him more than the truth ever could. But your father learned of it, near the end. He had always known, of course. It was he who arranged it. But in his last months, ill and frightened, and I think, wishing to set right whatever he still could before he died, he told me he meant to acknowledge Thomas formally in his will, to leave him a portion, openly, as his grandson, and to require, as part of the settlement, that the truth be told, gently, in its own time, so that Thomas need not go through life believing himself an orphan with no history at all. Her voice had begun to shake. I begged him not to. I told him it would destroy Thomas's peace more surely than any silence ever could, unearth a scandal that could only wound him, brand him before the whole county as Lady Ashby's bastard, rather than let him live quietly as Mrs. Pruitt's beloved nephew, which was, whatever the strict truth of it, the only childhood that had ever made him happy. My father would not be moved. He said the boy had a right to know his own blood, whatever the cost to my comfort, or the county's opinion, and he instructed Whitlock to draw the codicil accordingly. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the wall, Charles could hear the distant, rhythmic sound of a spade turning earth. Thomas Reed, going about his ordinary work, entirely unaware, still, of the storm that had gathered above his head these 26 years and was even now about to break. "You did not want this codicil delivered, madame," Poirot said, very carefully. "I did not want it delivered in its original form, no. God forgive me, Monsieur Poirot. I have spent 3 days now, wondering whether that wish, spoken perhaps too often and too bitterly in this house, in the weeks before my father died, might have found its way into the wrong ears, and taken root in some mind less patient, and very much less scrupulous than my own. I did not kill Edmund Whitlock. I did not kill my father. But I have asked myself, every night since, whether my grief and my fear for Thomas's peace gave someone else the excuse, or the courage, to do what I myself would never have countenanced. "Who, madame," Poirot asked quietly, "did you speak to, of this wish, in the weeks before your father died?" Miriam was silent a long moment, and when she answered, her voice had dropped almost to nothing. "Only Mrs. Pruitt, monsieur. Only ever Mrs. Pruitt. She has kept this secret with me for 26 years, and she loves that boy, I think, very nearly as much as I do myself. Perhaps, in the plain daily currency of a mother's love, rather more, since she has had the raising of him, and I have had only the distant watching. I told her, not a fortnight before my father died, that I would rather anything at all, than see Thomas's whole quiet, ordinary life torn open for the sake of a dying man's conscience. I did not mean it as instruction, Monsieur Poirot. I swear before God I did not mean it as instruction. But I have wondered, since, whether Mrs. Pruitt heard it as one." Chapter 12. The flask that lied Poirot spent the better part of that afternoon closeted with the small silver hip flask that had lain, empty and damning, upon the seat beside Edmund Whitlock's body, sent now, at his insistence, to a chemist of his acquaintance in York, whose findings arrived by telephone a little before 6, and which Poirot relayed to Inspector Yardley and Charles in the privacy of the morning-room with grim satisfaction. "Digitalis, Inspector. A tincture of foxglove, in a concentration a great deal higher than any physician would ever prescribe. Enough, my chemist assures me, to stop a healthy man's heart within the hour, and to do so in a manner that would present, to any but the most searching examination, precisely the symptoms of natural heart failure. It is, in short, exactly the poison a clever and patient person would choose, if that person wished a death to pass unremarked, and it is, further, a poison that grows in very nearly every cottage garden in England, requiring no chemist's license, no suspicious purchase that any shopkeeper might later recall and report. Foxglove, Yardley repeated slowly, grows wild all over this moor, for that matter. It does, Inspector, and it grows, I am reliably informed by our friend Mr. Reed, in very particular abundance in the physic border of the kitchen garden at Thornfield Hollow itself, planted there, as such borders traditionally are, for the old country remedies our grandmothers swore by, in small and carefully measured doses, for weak hearts and dropsy alike. A little digitalis, correctly prepared, has been a country doctor's medicine for 100 years. A great deal of it, incorrectly prepared, is a murderer's most reliable friend. Charles felt a chill pass over him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The kitchen garden, that's Mrs. Pruitt's province, isn't it? The herb borders, at least. She's spoken of it to me herself, once or twice, over the years, took a particular pride in it, as I recall, said her own mother had taught her the old remedies. She did indeed speak of it, mon ami, and with some pride, when I raised the subject with her myself this morning, quite in passing, before I knew all that I now know. Poirot's face had grown very still, very grave. I asked her, idly, what grew in her physic border, and she told me, without the least hesitation, foxglove among the rest, for the tincture, she said, is useful against a weak heart, taken correctly, a fact she said Lord Ashby himself was well aware of, since she had, on his own physician's earlier instruction, some years before Dr. Grant's tenure, prepared such a tincture for him herself, in the smallest and most careful of doses, and knew precisely, therefore, both its virtue and its danger. "You're saying she as good as told you she knew how to kill him," Yardley said, "and didn't even think it worth hiding." "I am saying, Inspector, that an innocent woman, proud of her old country knowledge, and entirely unaware it might soon be turned against her, will often volunteer exactly the fact that would hang a guilty one, because it has not yet occurred to her that anyone suspects her at all. It is one of the oldest and most reliable signs I know, in a long career of reading the small, unguarded moments of frightened and unfrightened people alike." He rose and moved to the window, looking out toward the darkening kitchen garden, where the last of the day's light caught, faintly, on rows of withered stems awaiting winter. She has the knowledge, Inspector. She has had, for 26 years, the deepest possible motive, a mother's fear, or as near a mother's fear as any woman's love for a child not born of her own body can be, which is to say, I think, every bit as fierce. She had access to Lord Ashby's food and drink for 60 years, entirely unremarked, as any trusted housekeeper does, and she had, on the evening Edmund Whitlock died, one further and very particular advantage that I have only this hour understood the true significance of. What advantage, Monsieur Poirot? It was Mrs. Pruitt, Inspector, who told this household that Mr. Whitlock had telephoned the lodge gate at 5 o'clock to say he would be delayed a further hour. It was Mrs. Pruitt who reported that message to Lady Ashby, second-hand, from old Sanders at the Gate Lodge. I should like, before this evening is out, to speak to Sanders myself, and to ask him a question that I confess did not occur to me until this very hour, namely, whether that telephone message was truly received from Edmund Whitlock's own voice at all, or whether it was, perhaps, relayed to him by someone standing rather closer to hand. Chapter 13. The Emotional Turning Point. Old Sanders, the lodge-keeper, was a slow-spoken man of 70 who had manned the gate at Thornfield for as long as Charles could remember, and he answered Poirot's careful questioning that evening with the unhurried thoroughness of a man for whom no one had ever before troubled to ask his opinion on anything of importance. "The message, sir? Aye, I mind it well enough, seeing as it's been asked of me twice now. Telephone rang a little after 5, and a voice said, 'This is Mr. Whitlock's message. He's had trouble on the road and will be a further hour delayed. Tell them not to hold dinner past 7. I wrote it down just as I heard it, and sent my grandson up to the house directly, same as always. You did not speak with Mr. Whitlock yourself on this occasion. You had met him before, I collect, on his previous visits to Thornfield. That's the odd thing of it, sir, now you ask so particular. I did not speak with him myself. The message came through the housekeeper's line, not the main house line at all, and it was Mrs. Pruitt herself relayed it to me at the gate, not 5 minutes later, walking down in person to say she'd taken the call inside and wanted it passed along proper, since I'm a bit deaf on the telephone these days, and she didn't trust me not to garble it. He scratched his head. I thought nothing of it at the time, sir. Seemed a kindness, if anything, her troubling to walk down in the damp to see the message right. Poirot's eyes had grown very bright. Mrs. Pruitt told you she had taken a telephone call from Edmund Whitlock himself, on her own line, and walked down personally to relay it to you, rather than trust it to your own hearing of the main house telephone. That's the size of it, sir. Aye. Sanders, Poirot said, very gently, I must ask you a question of great delicacy, and I ask you to consider it with great care before you answer. Is it possible? Is it, in your long experience of that housekeeper's line, and of Mrs. Pruitt's voice, which I collect you have known for the better part of your own lifetime, that the call you believe came from London, from Edmund Whitlock, was, in truth, no call from London at all? That Mrs. Pruitt herself might have placed that call, or invented that message entire, from within this house, to explain a delay that she alone, at that hour, had reason to know was coming? Old Sanders went very pale, and was silent a long moment, turning his cap slowly in his gnarled hands. I couldn't swear to whose voice it truly was on that first ring, sir. Not now you put it so plain. A telephone line does strange things to a voice, and I've never claimed my hearing was what it was. But I'll tell you this, and I've not spoken of it before, because I didn't rightly know what to make of it. Mrs. Pruitt come down to that gate herself, that evening, not once, but twice. Once with the message, near 5:30, as I've said. And once again, sir, a good deal later, gone 8, I'd have said, near dark, walking down alone, toward the road, with a covered basket on her arm, saying only that she'd a small errand for the kitchen, and would I mind the gate a little longer, before I locked up for the night. I minded it, sir, being paid to mind exactly such things, and ask no questions, and I've been asking myself every night since whether I ought to have asked one. The silence that followed this admission seemed, to Charles, to stretch on a very long time, broken at last by Poirot's soft, grave voice. "Thank you, Sanders. You have done nothing wrong in your long silence. A servant obeys the reasonable instructions of the household he serves, and there was nothing in a housekeeper's basket, on an ordinary evening errand, to rouse a gatekeeper's suspicion. But I think, now, that we have very nearly the whole shape of this matter before us, and I think further that it falls to me to speak with Mrs. Pruitt herself, this same night, before another soul in this household has cause to suffer for a truth she alone, I believe, has carried these 26 years, and carried, at the last, one grief too far." Chapter 14. Exhuming the Truth. "There remains one matter," Poirot said, the following morning, to Inspector Yardley and to Cordelia both, gathered in the library before the whole household had risen. "That must be settled beyond any doubt, before I permit myself to lay a full accusation before this family. For an accusation of murder made, and later proved mistaken, is a cruelty I do not permit myself lightly. I believe, with very great confidence, that Lord Ashby's death, 1 month past, was no natural failure of an old man's heart, but the same slow and careful poisoning, in smaller and more patient doses, that killed Edmund Whitlock outright at this very gate. But belief, Inspector, however confident, is not proof, and I think the law will want a great deal more than the word of Hercule Poirot before it hangs a woman on it." "You mean to have him exhumed?" Cordelia said, very white but steady. "I mean to ask it of you, madame, as his daughter, since I have no authority of my own to order such a thing, and I ask it with the fullest understanding of what I ask. That your father's rest be disturbed, his body examined a second time, in circumstances a great deal less gentle than the sick-room in which Dr. Grant first pronounced him dead. I would not ask it, madame, if I believed there were any other way to be certain, for myself, and for the law, and, I think, for the peace of this house, which will never truly settle again until the whole truth is known and no longer merely suspected in whispers behind closed doors." Cordelia was silent a long moment, her hands folded very tightly in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice, though quiet, did not waver. "My father spent his last months frightened, Monsieur Poirot, and unable to say clearly why, and I have watched this house consume itself with grief and suspicion for 4 weeks now, not knowing what killed him, or why Edmund Whitlock died at our gate 3 days later. I would rather know the whole of it, however terrible, than spend the rest of my life uncertain whether I dined, unknowing, at the same table as the person who killed him. You have my consent, and gladly, whatever it costs any of us." The exhumation was carried out with what discretion the law permitted, 2 days later, under a grey Yorkshire sky, that Charles thought suited the grim business of it a great deal better than any brighter weather could have done, and the findings, when the county pathologist delivered them to Poirot and Yardley together in the estate office, confirmed exactly what Poirot had, with quiet certainty, already predicted. "Digitalis," the pathologist said, laying his report upon the desk, "administered, in the pathologist's professional judgment, over a period of some months, in small, escalating doses, consistent with a slow and deliberate poisoning, rather than any natural decline of the cardiac muscle. I will say, gentlemen, that had the body not been examined so soon after burial, and had Monsieur Poirot's suspicion not directed our search so precisely toward this particular substance, it is entirely possible, I would go so far as to say probable, that this finding would never have been made at all. It is a patient poisoner's poison, gentlemen, and whoever administered it understood that patients very exactly. Poirot received this confirmation with none of the satisfaction Charles might have expected of a man whose theory had just been proved correct, but with a grave, tired sorrow that surprised him. I take no pleasure in being right, Monsieur le Docteur, when being right means that an old man I once counted, in a small way, as my friend, was murdered slowly, in his own bed, by a hand he trusted above almost any other in this house, and that the reason for it, when it is finally laid before this family, will break at least one heart among them that has already, I think, been broken quite enough for one lifetime. He gathered the report carefully and rose. Inspector, I believe we have now everything the law will require. I should like, this evening, to gather the household one final time and to lay the whole matter before them, plainly, and to give Mrs. Pruitt, for I do not think at this point any of us doubt any longer where this trail has led, the chance to hear it said aloud and to answer for it before witnesses who have every right to hear the truth from her own lips. Chapter 15. The net tightens. Before the gathering that evening, Poirot walked once more, alone but for Charles, down to the lodge gate, and stood a long while in the fading light, looking back at the grey house and turning the whole matter over, aloud, as was his habit when the final pieces of a case were settling into their last, exact places. Consider it with me, mon ami, from the beginning, as I have now assembled it. Lord Ashby, in his final illness, grows suspicious of Dr. Grant's stewardship of the accounts, yes, but that suspicion, I think now, was always the lesser matter, a genuine grievance, but not the deepest one. The deepest matter, the one that truly occupied his conscience in those last frightened months, was his grandson, Thomas Reed, raised these 26 years as Mrs. Pruitt's nephew, and never told the truth of his own birth. Lord Ashby resolves, at the end, to set that matter right, whatever the cost to his daughter's comfort or the county's opinion, and instructs Whitlock to draw a codicil that will acknowledge the boy formally and require the truth, at last, to be told. And Mrs. Pruitt learns of this. She learns of it from Miriam herself, who spoke of her fear too often and too bitterly in the weeks before her father's death, never intending instruction, but planting, all the same, in a mind already primed by 26 years of fierce and secret motherhood, the seed of exactly the desperation that flowers, in certain natures, into murder. Mrs. Pruitt does not wish to see Thomas's quiet, ordinary happiness torn open. She does not wish to see the boy she has raised as her own branded, before the whole county, as Lady Ashby's bastard rather than allowed to remain, in his own simple understanding of himself, her beloved nephew. And so she begins, quietly, patiently, exactly as her 60 years of faithful service had taught her to do everything, with care, with precision, with a housekeeper's absolute command of every cup and dish that passed before her master's lips, to ensure that Lord Ashby does not live long enough to see his new codicil signed and witnessed and made irrevocable. They walked on a little way toward the gate itself, where the green saloon had, at last, been removed, leaving only a faint scar in the gravel to mark where it had stood. But Lord Ashby dies before the codicil is properly finalized, before Whitlock has had it witnessed and sealed. Mrs. Pruitt believes, I think, in that first month, that she has succeeded, that with her master dead, the matter of Thomas's parentage dies quietly with him, unspoken, unwitnessed, safely buried alongside a man who can no longer insist upon its telling. And then Cordelia writes to Whitlock, and Whitlock telephones to say he is bringing the codicil after all, drawn in Lord Ashby's own hand and witnessed some weeks before his death, valid and binding whether the old man lived to see it read aloud or not. Mrs. Pruitt learns this, I think, from the same household gossip that reaches every corner of a house like this one, and understands, in that moment, that her first murder has brought her nothing at all, that the truth she killed to prevent is coming to Thornfield regardless, carried in a solicitor's dispatch case on a foggy evening by a man she has never had any particular quarrel with, save that he carries, quite unknowingly, the one document that can undo everything she has done. So she kills him too, Charles said quietly, at this very gate. She contrives the message of delay, whether by placing a false telephone call herself, or simply inventing the message entire and trusting to old Sanders's poor hearing and her own long-trusted position to see it accepted without question. I do not yet know which, and it scarcely matters now. She gains, in this way, a window of certainty, an hour, 2 hours, in which the household waits indoors, anxious but not yet alarmed, while she herself walks down to this gate, where Whitlock has, I believe, already arrived and stopped, perhaps to consult his papers, perhaps merely to compose himself before the difficult interview ahead, and she offers him, as any trusted old family servant might, a warming draught against the cold and the fog, poured, I think, from her own flask into his, or perhaps directly into his own flask, while his attention is elsewhere, engaged in gathering his papers. He drinks, he dies, within the hour, exactly as her long experience with the tincture had taught her he would. And she takes the dispatch case, forces the lock to disguise the theft as ordinary robbery, and leaves in its place the old will she has kept these 2 years, since she herself, as a woman trusted with every corner of this house, would have had ample opportunity to obtain a copy of it long before. And the basket Sanders saw her carrying later that evening. Poirot's face was grim. I think, mon ami, we shall find, when we ask her plainly, that it carried the true codicil itself, burned most probably in her own kitchen grate that same night, or buried somewhere upon this moor, where no one but herself will ever find it. It is the one piece of this puzzle I cannot yet prove, and the one question I mean to ask her directly, this very evening, before the whole household, for I think a woman who has carried so heavy a secret for 26 years, and killed twice to protect it, may yet find some measure of relief in laying it down at last, before people who have every right to hear it. Chapter 16. The Gathering of Suspects. They assembled, that final evening, in the drawing-room, where the whole strange business had begun. Cordelia and Julian, Miriam and Louisa, Dr. Grant, pale and diminished but present, Inspector Yardley by the door, and Mrs. Pruitt herself, summoned from her sitting-room, and standing now near the cold hearth with the same upright composure she had shown Poirot on the first morning of his questioning, as though 60 years of service had taught her, whatever else it had taught her, never to let a household see her falter. "I have asked you all here," Poirot began, standing where he had stood on the evening of his arrival, "because I promised, madame," with a small bow to Cordelia, "that I would tell you everything Thornfield Hollow had been keeping to itself, and I am, at the last, a man of my word, however unwelcome the word proves to be." He laid the whole of it before them, patiently, step by careful step, exactly as he had laid it before Charles at the gate that afternoon. Lord Ashby's growing suspicion of Dr. Grant's stewardship, real but secondary, the deeper matter of Thomas Reed's true parentage, and Miriam's long, silent grief, the codicil that would have told the truth, and the fear that truth provoked in the one heart in this house that had loved Thomas Reed longest and most fiercely, the slow poisoning of an old man's food and drink across the length of a final summer, the false telephone message, the gate, the flask, the forced dispatch case, the basket carried out into the dark. Julian had gone very white. Louisa was weeping openly. Cordelia sat rigid, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Pruitt's face with an expression Charles could not read. Grief and horror, and beneath it, perhaps, something that was almost pity. "It is not true," Mrs. Pruitt said, when Poirot had finished, but her voice had none of its old certainty. It was the voice, Charles thought, of a woman who has rehearsed a denial so long that she no longer quite believes it herself. "I think it is entirely true, madame," Poirot said gently, "and I think, in your own heart, you have known for some days now that it must eventually be said aloud. I do not ask you to confirm it for the law's sake alone, though the law will have its proof regardless, from the pathologist's report, and from old Sanders's testimony, and from 100 small threads that, taken together, leave no other honest conclusion. I ask you to confirm it because I think you are tired, madame, tired of 26 years of silence, and tired most of all, these last dreadful weeks, of carrying alone a burden that has already cost 2 lives and threatens now to cost a 3rd, if you continue to let an innocent man's reputation and a grieving family's peace be sacrificed to a secret You can no longer protect by any means but the truth." Mrs. Pruitt's composure broke, at last, all at once, like a dam too long straining against a weight it was never built to hold. She sank into the nearest chair, her face in her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was scarcely more than a whisper. "I raised that boy from a cradle no bigger than my 2 hands, monsieur. I buried my own child that same winter, in the same ground he should have lain in, and when they placed him in my arms instead, I don't expect any of you to understand what that meant to a woman who'd lost everything else. I was not going to let an old man's dying conscience take him from me a second time. Not his name, not his peace, not the simple, ordinary happiness of a boy who never once, in 26 years, looked at me as anything but his own dear aunt." She looked up, and her eyes found Miriam's across the room, and something passed between them that was not quite forgiveness, but was not, Charles thought, entirely its opposite either. "I never meant for it to come to this, my lady. I meant only to buy him a little more time in the only peace he'd ever known. I did not know how to stop once I had begun, and each thing I did only made the next thing more necessary, until I looked up one evening at that gate and found I had killed a second man to protect a secret I was no longer at all certain deserved protecting." "The codicil, madame," Poirot said quietly. "What became of it?" "Burned, monsieur, that same night, in my own kitchen grate, page by page, until nothing remained but ash I scattered on the moor before morning." Her voice broke entirely. "I am glad, in a strange way, to have it said aloud at last. I have not slept a whole night through since Lord Ashby died, and I do not think, whatever the law decides for me now, that I could have borne very much more of the silence." Inspector Yardley, moving forward at last with the grave formality his office required, spoke the words that ended, in the plainest and most final way, the strange business of Thornfield Hollow's last guest, and Mrs. Pruitt rose to meet them with the same upright dignity she had carried through 60 years of faithful service, as though even now, at the very end of it, she could not quite set the habit of composure aside. Chapter 17. The Little Grey Cells at Rest. It was nearly a week later, the business of Thornfield Hollow settled at last into the slower, sadder rhythms of a household beginning to rebuild itself, when Charles found Poirot in the library, taking his leave of Cordelia before the hired motor car carried him back toward the railway station, and beyond it, London. "You will tell him, madame?" Poirot was asking, as Charles entered. "Thomas Reed. He deserves, I think, to hear the truth from his own family, gently and in his own time, rather than piece it together from the county's gossip, which will not, I fear, be either gentle or accurate, whatever care is taken. Miriam means to tell him herself, when she can find the courage for it," Cordelia said. "She has waited 26 years, Monsieur Poirot. I think she can find the courage for a few weeks more, if it means telling him properly, and giving him time to know her a little, as more than his employer's sister, before the whole weight of it falls on him at once. That is wisdom, madame, and I am glad of it. A truth long buried does not always need to be unearthed all at once, provided it is unearthed honestly, at the last, and with love enough to soften what it costs." Poirot took up his hat and gloves. "And Dr. Grant? He has resigned the trusteeship, and means to make what restitution he can from his own small remaining fortune, though it will take him the rest of his working life, I think, to repay what he took. I have told him I will not press criminal charges, provided the restitution is made in full, and honestly, my father, I believe, would have wished for mercy there, whatever his anger might have been, had he lived to discover the theft himself. Grant was a coward, Monsieur Poirot, and a thief, but he was never, in the end, a murderer, and I find I have very little appetite left, after all this house has suffered, for punishing a lesser sin as though it were the greater one." Poirot inclined his head, approving. "You have your father's sense of proportion, madame, whatever else you may or may not have inherited from him. It is a rarer quality than cleverness, and a good deal more valuable, in the end, to the running of a house or a life." Charles walked with him out to the waiting motor car, through the same grey autumn light that had greeted his own arrival what felt now like a very long time before, though it had been scarcely a fortnight. "You are troubled, monsieur," Charles observed, as Poirot settled his small, precise figure into the seat. "You solved it. You found the truth, and the innocent are cleared, and the guilty answers for it. Is that not the whole of your satisfaction? It is the whole of my duty, mon ami, which is not always quite the same thing as satisfaction." Poirot looked back, once, at the grey bulk of Thornfield Hollow receding behind the mist. "I have solved 100 such cases in my life, and I have learned, in the solving of them, that the truth is very rarely a simple villain and a simple victim, whatever the newspapers prefer to print. It is very often an old grief, buried imperfectly, that grows and grows in the dark until it can no longer be contained by silence alone, and bursts, at last, into violence that harms far more people than it was ever meant to protect. Mrs. Pruitt did not kill for gold, nor for hatred, nor for any of the tidy motives a lazier detective prefers to find. She killed for love, monsieur, a fierce, twisted, and ultimately murderous love, but love all the same, and it is love, I think, more often than hatred, that darkens the human heart past all recovery, when it is allowed to grow unchecked and unexamined for too many years. That is not a very comfortable thought for a detective to end his case upon. "No," Poirot agreed with a small, tired smile, "it is not. But I have never claimed, mon ami, to deal in comfortable thoughts. I deal only in the truth, however it presents itself, and I have found, across a long career, that the truth is a good deal more often sad than it is wicked, and a good deal more often human, in all its frightened, loving, foolish weakness, than it is monstrous. That, I think, is the only comfort my little grey cells have ever truly been able to offer anyone. Not that the world is free of darkness, but that the darkness, examined closely enough, so very often turns out to be nothing stranger or less forgivable than an ordinary heart, breaking quietly, for far too long, in a house that never thought to ask it why." The motor car pulled away down the long drive, past the lodge gate where a man had once waited, forever, to be let in, and out onto the moor road, where the fog was, at last, beginning to lift. Charles stood a long while at the gate after the motor car had gone, watching the place where the road bent away out of sight beyond the yews, and found himself thinking not of Poirot's small, retreating figure, nor even of Mrs. Pruitt's ravaged face in that last terrible hour in the drawing-room, but of Thomas Reed, still bent over his ordinary work somewhere beyond the garden wall, digging in beds that would in the spring put out foxglove again as they had every year of his unknowing life, tall and purple and lovely and lethal in exactly the quantities the old country wisdom had always known them to be. It seemed to Charles, standing there in the thinning fog, that this was the truest shape of the whole sad business. Not the cleverness of the crime, nor even the cleverness of its unravelling, but this: a boy who had grown up, loved, and ignorant, and content, tending a garden that had, without his knowledge, held the whole of his family's grief and violence, coiled quietly among its ordinary blooms, waiting only for someone desperate enough to put it to its darker use. He wondered whether Thomas would ever be able to look at that particular corner of the garden again without some shadow of what he would, in time, come to learn, and hoped, for the boy's sake, that Miriam's courage, when at last it came, would be gentle enough to let him keep at least the memory of an ordinary childhood, however extraordinary its true beginning had been. He walked back up toward the house as the last of the fog lifted properly from the moor, revealing, for the first time in a fortnight, the full grey sweep of the hills beyond Thornfield Hollow, bare and quiet and entirely indifferent, as such places always are, to the small, fierce, breaking hearts of the people who live and die within sight of them. Cordelia was waiting for him on the step, and together, without much needing to say so aloud, they went in to see what could be done, in the slow and patient way that such things are always eventually done, about beginning the household's healing, the end.